The gunshot echoed through the Montana wilderness as Catherine Sullivan stumbled across the rugged terrain, her heart pounding against her ribs like a frightened animal trying to escape its cage. Blood trickled from a gash on her forearm, her once fine blue dress now torn and caked with dust from 3 days on the run. The year was 1876, and she had never imagined her journey west would lead her here hunted like prey across the untamed frontier. Catherine's lungs burned with each ragged breath as she pushed through a thicket of brush, the branches clawing at her face and arms. The distant sound of hoofbeats spurred her forward despite her body's desperate pleas to stop. The men who had murdered her traveling companion wouldn't hesitate to do the same to her once they caught up, not after what she had witnessed. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, though she had no destination in mind. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, painting the Montana hills in shades of amber and gold. Beautiful, she might have thought under different circumstances. Her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her sprawling onto the hard ground. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand, collapsing back to the earth with a soft cry. Tears of frustration and fear welled in her eyes as she dragged herself behind a fallen tree, pressing her back against the rough bark. The hoofbeats grew louder. Catherine pressed her hand against her mouth to muffle her breathing, her entire body trembling. She closed her eyes, preparing for the worst, but the rider who crested the hill wasn't one of her pursuers. A tall man on a chestnut mare moved cautiously through the trees, his eyes scanning the landscape with practiced precision. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but his posture was alert, wary. Catherine remained frozen, uncertain if this stranger represented salvation or another threat. The decision was made for her when her injured ankle shifted, sending a cascade of pebbles down the small embankment where she hid. The rider's head snapped in her direction, hand moving instinctively to the holster at his hip. Catherine tried to scramble away, but her strength had finally abandoned her. She collapsed onto the ground, her vision blurring as exhaustion overtook her. Through the haze of consciousness, she felt rather than saw the stranger dismount and approach. Strong hands gently turned her over, and she found herself staring into concerned eyes the color of storm clouds. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're coming." "Who's coming?" His voice was low and steady, with a slight drawl that marked him as a man who'd spent his life in these territories. "Bad men," was all she could manage as darkness crept into the edges of her vision. The last thing Catherine remembered was being lifted into strong arms as the stranger spoke words that would echo in her memory for years to come. "You can rest now. I've got you." When Catherine opened her eyes, the world was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight. She lay on a bed covered with a patchwork quilt, the air around her fragrant with the smell of coffee and wood smoke. For a moment, she thought she might be dreaming, or perhaps she had died after all, and this was some peaceful afterlife. The sharp pain in her ankle when she tried to move dispelled that notion quickly enough. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," came a voice from across the room. "That ankle needs rest." Catherine turned her head to see the man from the woods sitting in a chair by the fireplace, a steaming cup in his hand. In the light, she could see him clearly, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held a kindness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Where am I?" she asked, her throat dry and voice raspy. "My cabin," he replied, setting down his cup and moving to pour water from a pitcher into a glass. "About 15 miles east of Fort Benton." Catherine accepted the water gratefully, taking small sips as her mind raced with questions. "How long have I been here?" just since nightfall. It's a little past midnight now." He pulled his chair closer to the bed. "I'm Kieran Mitchell. Most folks around here call me Mitch." "Catherine Sullivan," she replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving her real name. Trust came at a high price in her current situation. "Well, Miss Sullivan, mind telling me why you were running through the wilderness like the devil himself was on your heels?" Catherine lowered the glass, studying him. This man had saved her life, but caution had become second nature these past few days. "How do I know I can trust you?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Fair question. I suppose you don't. But considering I could have left you out there for whoever was chasing you to find, I'd say I've earned at least a small measure of trust." He had a point. Catherine took a deep breath and decided to risk a partial truth. "I was traveling with a stagecoach headed to Fort Benton. 3 days ago we were attacked by a group of men. They killed the driver and the other passengers." She paused, the memory still raw. "I managed to escape during the confusion. They've been tracking me ever since." "Bandits?" Kieran asked, his expression darkening. Catherine hesitated. "Not exactly. They were well-dressed, organized. They knew what they were looking for." "And what was that?" "I don't know," she lied. "But they seemed intent on leaving no witnesses." Kieran studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine how much of her story was true. "Well, you're safe here for now. I've tended to that cut on your arm and wrapped your ankle. It's not broken, just a bad sprain." "Thank you," Catherine said, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization that this was the first moment of safety she'd experienced in days. To her embarrassment, tears began to well in her eyes. Kieran cleared his throat and stood, seemingly uncomfortable with her emotion. "You should get some more rest. We'll figure out what to do in the morning." Catherine nodded, too exhausted to argue. As Kieran moved to leave the small bedroom, she called out, "Mr. Mitchell." He paused in the doorway. "Yes. Why did you help me?" His expression softened slightly. "Out here, we look after folks in trouble. It's just the way of things." With that, he closed the door, leaving Catherine alone with her thoughts. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully. Each time she drifted off, nightmares of the stagecoach attack jerked her back to consciousness. The sounds of gunfire, the screams, the sight of Thomas collapsing with a bullet in his chest, the leather satchel falling from his grasp. By dawn, Catherine had abandoned the pursuit of rest. She sat up carefully, testing her ankle with a grimace. It was swollen and tender but bore her weight when she cautiously stood. Limping to the small window, she pushed aside the rough burlap curtain to reveal a breathtaking vista of rolling hills covered in wildflowers and tall grass that swayed in the morning breeze. In the distance, mountains rose like sentinels against the pale blue sky. The cabin door opened, and Catherine turned to see Kieran entering with an armful of firewood. He paused when he saw her standing. "You should be resting that ankle," he said, moving to deposit the wood beside the stone fireplace. "I've never been good at sitting still," Catherine replied. "Besides, I've imposed on your hospitality enough already." Kieran busied himself building a fire. "Where exactly do you plan on going with that ankle?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The truth was, Catherine had nowhere to go. Her original plan to reach her cousin's home in Helena had been derailed by the attack. And with men still hunting her, traveling alone was as good as signing her own death warrant. "I'll figure something out," she finally said, lifting her chin with a determination she didn't entirely feel. Kieran glanced up at her, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Stubborn, aren't you? Sit down before you fall down. I've got breakfast cooking." Catherine reluctantly eased herself into the chair he had vacated the night before, watching as he moved with efficient grace around the small cabin. For a man who lived alone in the wilderness, His home was surprisingly tidy and well-ordered. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked as he placed a plate of eggs and fried potatoes before her. "Going on 5 years now." Kieran poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "I came west after the war. Needed some space to clear my head. The war between the states. It had ended 11 years ago, but its shadow still stretched long across the country." "You fought?" Kieran nodded, a shadow crossing his face. "Union cavalry, but that's a lifetime ago now." He changed the subject abruptly. "What brought you out to Montana Territory?" Catherine hesitated, wondering how much to reveal. "My parents died last winter. Influenza. I was teaching at a school in Boston, but there was nothing holding me there anymore. My cousin Emily lives in Helena with her husband. She invited me to come stay with them." It was the truth, if not the complete truth. She omitted the part about Thomas Jenkins, her father's law partner, who had approached her with a proposition 2 months after her parents' funeral, a chance to start fresh with a substantial sum of money, if she would help him deliver certain documents to a contact in Montana Territory. "I'm sorry about your parents," Kieran said, his voice softening. "Losing family is never easy." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with grief. Catherine wondered about his story but didn't press. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling in the hearth. After breakfast, Kieran announced he needed to check his trap lines and tend to his horse. "I'll be back by midday. Keep off that ankle as much as you can. There's a rifle above the fireplace if you need it." The implication was clear: if her pursuers found this place while he was gone, she would need to defend herself. Catherine nodded, grateful for both his concern and his practicality. Once alone, Catherine took the opportunity to explore the cabin. It consisted of 2 rooms, the main living area with its fireplace, table and chairs, and the small bedroom where she had slept. A bookshelf against one wall held an impressive collection of volumes, ranging from practical guides on trapping and hunting to dog-eared copies of Shakespeare and Dickens. Not what she would have expected from a frontier trapper. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. Catherine couldn't resist picking it up. It showed a younger Kieran in a Union uniform, standing beside a woman with a gentle smile. His wife. The picture gave no clues, and Catherine set it down carefully, feeling like an intruder into his private life. Outside, the day had bloomed into full sunshine. Catherine moved to the doorway, breathing in the clean mountain air. The isolation that had seemed threatening in the darkness now felt peaceful, almost serene. No wonder Kieran had chosen this life, far from the noise and complications of civilization. As she turned to go back inside, movement on the horizon caught her eye. 3 riders, moving slowly but deliberately toward the cabin. Catherine's heart lurched into her throat as she quickly retreated inside, shutting and barring the door behind her. With trembling hands, she reached for the rifle above the fireplace. It was heavier than she expected, but not unfamiliar. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was young, believing every woman should know how to protect herself. Catherine positioned herself by the window, keeping to the side to avoid being seen. As the riders drew closer, she could make out their features. Relief flooded through her when she realized they weren't the men who had attacked the stagecoach. These riders wore the unmistakable attire of lawmen, led by an older man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Still, she kept the rifle ready as they approached the cabin and called out, "Hello, the cabin. Marshal Benjamin Lawson from Fort Benton. We're looking for Kieran Mitchell." Catherine hesitated, unsure whether to respond or remain hidden. Before she could decide, the marshal added, "We know someone's in there. We just want to talk." Taking a deep breath, Catherine called back, "Mr. Mitchell isn't here at the moment. What business do you have with him?" There was a pause then. "Madam, would you mind opening the door?" It's uncomfortable shouting through walls. Catherine considered her options. These men appeared to be legitimate lawmen, not the well-dressed killers who had pursued her. And if they were looking for Kieran, perhaps they could help her as well. "I'm opening the door," she called, setting the rifle aside but keeping it within reach. "Please keep your distance." She unbarred the door and stepped back, keeping her weight off her injured ankle as much as possible. The marshal entered first, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s, with a weathered face and shrewd eyes that assessed Catherine quickly. "Marshal Benjamin Lawson," he introduced himself formally. "These are my deputies, Sam Cooper and John Reid." The two younger men nodded respectfully from the doorway. "Catherine Sullivan," she replied, fighting the urge to smooth her wrinkled dress. "As I said, Mr. Mitchell is checking his trap lines. He should return by midday, and you are." The marshal left the question hanging. "A guest," Catherine said simply. "Mr. Mitchell found me injured in the woods yesterday evening and brought me here to recover." Marshal Lawson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so? Well, Miss Sullivan, perhaps you can help us. We're looking for witnesses to a stagecoach robbery that occurred 3 days ago. The overland stage from Helena was hit about 30 miles west of Fort Benton. 4 people were killed and a passenger is missing." Catherine's heart began to race, but she kept her expression neutral. "How terrible, but I don't see how I can help. I've been traveling alone on horseback." The lie came easily, born of necessity. The marshal studied her with experienced eyes. "That's interesting, because the missing passenger was described as a young woman traveling to Fort Benton. And here you are, injured and alone, found in the wilderness not far from where that attack took place." Catherine felt cold fear spreading through her chest. "A coincidence, Marshal, nothing more." "Perhaps," he conceded, though his tone suggested he believed otherwise. "Mind if I ask how you injured yourself?" "I fell from my horse," Catherine said, the rehearsed explanation ready. "The animal was spooked by a snake. I managed to make my way through the woods until Mr. Mitchell found me." "And where is this horse now?" Catherine faltered. I don't know. It ran off after I fell." Marshal Lawson nodded slowly, clearly not believing her story but choosing not to press further for the moment. "Well, Miss Sullivan, when Mr. Mitchell returns, please tell him we need to speak with him urgently. We'll be waiting in town." "Of course," Catherine agreed, relief washing over her at the thought of their imminent departure. As the marshal turned to leave, he paused. "One more thing, Miss Sullivan. The men who attacked that stagecoach weren't ordinary bandits. They were professional killers, hired to retrieve something valuable. If you should happen to recall anything about that incident, anything at all, I'd suggest you come forward sooner rather than later, for your own safety." With that thinly veiled warning, the marshal and his deputies departed, leaving Catherine standing in the doorway, her mind racing with new fears. If the marshal suspected her identity, how long before others made the same connection? Kieran returned just after noon to find Catherine pacing anxiously despite her injured ankle. She immediately recounted the visit from Marshal Lawson and his deputies, watching Kieran's expression carefully for his reaction. "Ben Lawson is a good man," Kieran said after listening to her story. "Honest as they come. If he's investigating that stagecoach attack, he'll get to the truth of it eventually." Catherine sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "That's what I'm afraid of." Kieran regarded her thoughtfully. "You weren't entirely honest with me about that stagecoach, were you?" After a long moment, Catherine shook her head. "No." "Want to try again?" Catherine weighed her options. Kieran had saved her life and offered protection when she needed it most. If anyone deserved the truth, it was him. And yet, involving him further might put his life at risk as well. "It's complicated," she began hesitantly, "and dangerous." Kieran pulled up a chair across from her. "I figured as much, but I'm already involved, like it or not. Might as well know what I've gotten myself into." Catherine took a deep breath and began her story. "I was indeed traveling on that stagecoach, bound for Fort Benton and then Helena. But I wasn't alone. I was accompanying a man named Thomas Jenkins, my father's law partner from Boston." She explained how Thomas had approached her after her parents' deaths, offering her a chance to start anew with a substantial sum of money. All she had to do was accompany him west, posing as his niece, while he delivered important documents to a business associate. "What kind of documents?" Kieran asked. "Land deeds, mining claims, contracts, I don't know the specifics." Thomas kept them in a leather satchel that never left his side. But whatever they were valuable enough for someone to kill for them. Catherine described the attack in detail, how the stagecoach had been forced to stop by men blocking the road, how Thomas had pushed her out the door as the shooting began, urging her to run and hide. "I watched from the woods as they searched the bodies and the stagecoach. They were arguing about a missing satchel. That's when I realized Thomas must have hidden it before he died." Catherine's voice trembled slightly at the memory. "One of them spotted me watching. I've been running ever since." Kieran absorbed her story in silence, his expression unreadable. "Do you know who these men were working for?" Catherine shook her head. "Thomas never said who his business associate was, only that he was a powerful man in Montana territory. But I overheard one of the attackers mention someone called Blackwood before they began searching for me." At the name, Kieran's face darkened. "Victor Blackwood, you know him?" "Everyone in Montana territory knows Blackwood," Kieran said grimly. "He owns half the businesses in Fort Benton and has mining interests throughout the territory. Started with nothing 20 years ago and built an empire through methods not always on the right side of the law." Catherine felt a chill at his words. "If he's as powerful as you say, how can I possibly stand against him?" "You don't," Kieran stated flatly. "Not alone, anyway." "What are you suggesting?" Kieran leaned forward, his expression serious. "First thing tomorrow, I'm taking you to Fort Benton to talk to Marshal Lawson. Tell him everything you've told me. If Blackwood is behind this, Lawson will want to know. And if the marshal can't protect me. Or worse, what if he's in Blackwood's pocket too?" "Lawson's not corrupt," Kieran assured her. "As for protection, you'll have me." Catherine studied him, puzzled by his willingness to put himself at risk for a stranger. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Kieran was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "Let's just say I've got no love for men like Blackwood who think their money puts them above the law. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've got a reputation around these parts as a man who finishes what he starts. I found you. I helped you. Seems only right I see this through." Catherine wasn't entirely convinced by his explanation, but was too grateful for his support to question it further. "Thank you," she said simply. As evening fell, they shared a simple meal of venison stew. Catherine found herself studying Kieran as he moved around the cabin, curious about this solitary man who had so readily offered his protection. Despite his rugged appearance and taciturn nature, there was an undeniable gentleness to him, a thoughtfulness that belied his frontier lifestyle. "The photograph on your mantel," she ventured as they finished eating. "Is that your wife?" Kieran glanced toward the daguerreotype, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "My sister Margaret, she died in '73, typhoid." "I'm sorry," Catherine said quietly. "Were you close?" "Very. After our parents died, it was just the two of us. She followed me west after the war, determined to keep an eye on her older brother." A sad smile crossed his face. Maggie never could stand to be left behind. The affection in his voice touched Catherine deeply. She must have been quite a woman. She was, Kieran agreed. Stubborn as the day is long. Reminds me a bit of you, actually. Catherine wasn't sure whether to be flattered or offended by the comparison. I prefer to think of it as determination. Call it what you like, Kieran said with a hint of amusement. It's the same quality that's kept you alive these past few days when others might have given up. His words warmed her more than she cared to admit. In the short time she had known him, Kieran Mitchell had come to represent safety in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. It was a dangerous feeling, this growing attachment to a man she barely knew, but in the isolation of the cabin with night falling around them, it seemed the most natural thing in the world. As they prepared for bed, Kieran insisting she take the bedroom while he slept by the fire, Catherine found herself reluctant to end their conversation. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that calmed her frayed nerves. "Kieran," she said as he turned to leave the bedroom. "Thank you, not just for the rescue but for believing me, for helping me." He paused in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the firelight. "Get some rest, Catherine. Tomorrow will be a long day." As she settled under the quilt, Catherine realized it was the first time he had called her by her given name rather than Miss Sullivan. The simple intimacy of it followed her into sleep, keeping the nightmares at bay, at least for that night. Morning arrived with a gentle rain tapping against the cabin roof. Catherine awoke feeling more rested than she had in days, despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. Her ankle, while still tender, had improved enough that she could walk with only a slight limp. Kieran had already prepared breakfast by the time she emerged from the bedroom, flapjacks with wild honey and strong coffee. As they ate, he outlined his plan for the day. "We'll ride double on Sadie," he said, referring to his mare. "It'll take about 3 hours to reach Fort Benton. Once there, we'll go straight to the marshal's office. Best to get your statement on record as quickly as possible." Catherine nodded, though anxiety gnawed at her stomach. "And afterward, we find somewhere safe for you to stay while Lawson investigates. I know a widow in town who takes in boarders. Decent woman, discreet. Won't Blackwood's men be watching for me in Fort Benton?" Kieran considered this. "Possibly, but they'll be looking for a woman traveling alone, not one accompanied by a known local. Besides, sometimes the safest place to hide is in plain sight." Catherine wasn't entirely convinced but had no better suggestions. As they prepared to leave, Kieran handed her a bundle of clothing. "These were Maggie's," he explained. "They might be a bit large on you, but they're practical for riding, and less conspicuous than that torn dress." Catherine accepted the offering gratefully. The simple skirt and blouse were indeed loose on her frame, but clean and sturdy. She pinned her hair up under a wide-brimmed hat Kieran provided, completing the transformation from Boston schoolteacher to frontier woman. When she emerged from the bedroom in her new attire, Kieran's eyes widened slightly. "You look different. Good different or bad different?" Catherine asked, feeling strangely self-conscious under his gaze. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Just different. More like you belong out here." The compliment, if that's what it was, warmed her cheeks. She busied herself gathering her few belongings to hide her reaction. They set out as the rain tapered off, leaving the air fresh and the hills around them vibrant with color. Catherine sat behind Kieran on Sadie, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. It was an intimate arrangement that would have scandalized Boston society, but out here in the wilderness, such proprieties seemed laughably irrelevant. As they rode, Catherine found herself noticing small details about Kieran, the breadth of his shoulders beneath her hands, The way he spoke softly to his horse when the trail grew steep, the subtle scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. It was disconcerting, this growing awareness of him as a man rather than simply as her rescuer. The journey passed largely in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by Kieran pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of local knowledge. He seemed to know every hill and valley, every stream and stand of trees. This was his home in a way Boston had never been hers. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horse and share a simple meal of jerky and biscuits. As they sat beneath the shelter of a large pine, Catherine found herself studying Kieran's profile. "How did you end up as a trapper?" she asked, genuinely curious about the path that had led him to this solitary existence. Kieran chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Wasn't always a trapper. After the war, I worked as a scout for the army, then tried my hand at ranching down near Billings. Neither suited me," he shrugged. "Trapping lets me be my own boss, set my own hours, no one telling me what to do." "Don't you get lonely?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Sometimes," he admitted after a pause, "but there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Most days I prefer the quiet. And the other days," Kieran glanced at her, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. "Those are the days I ride into town, have a drink at the saloon, remember what people sound like." Catherine tried to imagine such an existence, days or weeks without human contact, with only nature and one's thoughts for company. It seemed both terrifying and oddly appealing. "I think I'd go mad with no one to talk to," she confessed. Kieran's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "You might surprise yourself. Out here, you learn to hear things you never noticed before, the different songs of birds, the way the wind sounds through pine versus aspen, the voices of the rivers changing with the seasons." There was a poetry to his words that Catherine hadn't expected from this quiet, reserved man. It made her wonder what other depths lay beneath his stoic exterior. As they resumed their journey, the landscape gradually changed, the wild hills giving way to more settled country. They began to pass occasional homesteads and small farms, signs of civilization emerging from the wilderness. By mid-afternoon, the town of Fort Benton came into view, nestled against the Missouri River. Catherine had expected a rough frontier outpost, but Fort Benton surprised her with its relative sophistication. While certainly not Boston, it boasted several substantial brick buildings among the wooden structures, and steamboats lined the riverfront, evidence of the town's importance as a trading hub. Kieran guided Sadie through the busy streets, drawing curious glances from passers-by. A man as recognizable as Kieran arriving in town with an unknown woman was bound to attract attention, precisely what they had hoped to avoid. "Keep your hat low and your head down," Kieran murmured as they approached the marshal's office. "The less people see of your face, the better." Catherine complied, clutching the brim of her borrowed hat as Kieran helped her dismount. Her ankle protested the sudden weight, causing her to stumble slightly against him. His hand steadied her, strong and sure, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. The marshal's office was a solid brick building with barred windows and a weathered sign proclaiming law enforcement above the door. Inside, they found Deputy Reed at a desk, looking up in surprise as they entered. "Mitchell," he acknowledged with a nod. "Marshal's been looking for you." "That's why we're here," Kieran replied. "Miss Sullivan has information about that stagecoach robbery. Where's Lawson?" Reed's eyes narrowed as he recognized Catherine. "Out on patrol. Should be back within the hour." He gestured toward a bench against the wall. "You can wait if you've a mind to." Kieran guided Catherine to the bench, positioning himself beside her like a shield between her and the deputy's curious gaze. They sat in tense silence for nearly 20 minutes, before the office door swung open, admitting Marshal Lawson along with a blast of afternoon heat. Lawson paused when he saw them, his expression shifting from surprise to satisfaction. "Mitchell, Miss Sullivan, I had a feeling I might be seeing you two again." "Marshal," Kieran greeted him with a nod. "Miss Sullivan has a story you need to hear. Somewhere private would be best." Lawson assessed them for a moment, then jerked his head toward a door at the back of the room. "My office. Read, hold any visitors unless it's an emergency." The marshal's office was small but neat, with wanted posters lining one wall and a large map of Montana territory on another. Lawson settled behind his desk, gesturing for Catherine and Kieran to take the chairs opposite. "Now then, Miss Sullivan," he said once they were seated, "I suspect you weren't entirely forthcoming with me yesterday." Catherine glanced at Kieran, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she began her story again, this time omitting nothing: her arrangement with Thomas Jenkins, the documents he carried, the attack on the stagecoach, and the name she had overheard: Blackwood. Lawson listened without interruption, his weathered face betraying little of his thoughts. When Catherine finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled before him. "That's quite a tale, Miss Sullivan," he said finally. "And not one I'm inclined to dismiss, despite its extraordinary nature. Victor Blackwood has been a person of interest to me for some time, though he's careful to keep his hands clean of any direct wrongdoing." "Then you believe me?" Catherine asked, relief evident in her voice. "I believe you believe what you're telling me," Lawson clarified. "Whether Blackwood ordered those murders is another matter entirely. We'll need evidence, not just hearsay." "The satchel," Kieran suggested. "If we could find it, the documents inside might provide that evidence." Lawson nodded slowly. "Possibly. Miss Sullivan, do you have any idea where Jenkins might have hidden it before he died?" Catherine shook her head. "He pushed me out of the stagecoach as soon as the attack began, told me to run and hide. I never saw what he did with the satchel." "But you're certain the attackers didn't find it?" "I heard them arguing about it. One man was shouting at the others for letting it slip through their fingers." The marshal considered this information thoughtfully. "The attack site has been cleared, bodies removed, stagecoach salvaged for parts. But I could organize a search of the immediate area." "Meanwhile, what about Catherine's safety?" Kieran pressed. "If Blackwood's men are still looking for her, she's in danger every moment she remains in the open." Lawson's eyes moved between them, calculating. "I can offer protection while you're in town, but my jurisdiction and resources are limited. Blackwood has connections throughout the territory, friends in high places who might not take kindly to accusations against him." "So you're saying you can't help?" Kieran's voice held a note of challenge. "I'm saying I'll do what I can within the bounds of the law," Lawson corrected firmly. "Miss Sullivan should remain in town where I can keep an eye on her. I'll start an official investigation into the stagecoach attack, focusing on finding that satchel. In the meantime, I suggest you both keep a low profile." It wasn't the decisive action Catherine had hoped for, but she understood the marshal's position. Accusations against a man as powerful as Blackwood required solid evidence, not just the word of a woman who had been running scared for days. As they prepared to leave, Lawson added, "One more thing. Blackwood is hosting a reception at his home tomorrow evening, some kind of celebration for the railroad survey being approved. Half the town will be there, including me. Might be worth noting who attends and how they interact with our host." Kieran raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Lawson replied innocently. "Just sharing information about a public event. What you do with that information is your business." As they left the marshal's office, Catherine felt both relieved and disappointed. They had an ally in Lawson, but his hands were tied by legal constraints and political realities. If they wanted to expose Blackwood, they would need to be creative and careful. Kieran led her down the bustling main street toward a modest two-story house set back from the road. A sign reading, "Mrs. Haverford's Boarding House," hung beside the door. "Eliza Haverford is a good woman," Kieran explained as they approached. "Her husband was a friend of mine before he passed. She'll give you a room without asking too many questions." "And you?" Catherine asked, suddenly reluctant to part from the one person who had proven trustworthy in this dangerous situation. "I'll get a room at the hotel across the street," Kieran said, nodding toward a three-story building with peeling paint. "Close enough to reach you quickly if needed, but not so close as to raise eyebrows." The practicality of his arrangement made sense, but Catherine couldn't help feeling a twinge of disappointment. She had grown accustomed to his presence, the sense of security it provided. Mrs. Haverford proved to be a plump, cheerful widow in her 50s who welcomed Catherine warmly while shooting curious glances at Kieran. "Any friend of Mr. Mitchell's is welcome here," she assured Catherine after Kieran explained they needed a quiet room for a lady recently arrived in town. "Though I must say, it's a surprise to see him escorting a young woman. Usually keeps to himself, this one does." Kieran cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Sullivan is an acquaintance from back east. She's considering settling in the area and asked for my guidance." It was a flimsy cover story, but Mrs. Haverford seemed more amused than suspicious. "Well, you've come to the right place, dear. Fort Benton's growing every day. We've even got a proper school now if you're looking for teaching work." The mention of teaching reminded Catherine of her former life in Boston, now seemingly a lifetime ago. How simple things had been then, how predictable and safe. The thought brought an unexpected wave of homesickness. Once Catherine was settled in a small but clean room at the back of the house, Kieran prepared to take his leave. They stood awkwardly in the narrow hallway, suddenly unsure how to navigate this new arrangement. "I'll check on you in the morning," Kieran promised. "Try not to leave the boarding house unless necessary. If you need me before then, Mrs. Haverford knows how to find me." Catherine nodded, fighting an irrational urge to ask him to stay. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." Something shifted in Kieran's eyes, a softening, a moment of vulnerability quickly masked. "Get some rest, Catherine. You're safe here." As he turned to go, Catherine caught his arm. "Kieran, about what Marshal Lawson said Blackwood's reception tomorrow. Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" A slow smile spread across his face. "That it might be worth attending. The thought had crossed my mind. It would be an opportunity to observe Blackwood in his element, perhaps even discover who he's working with," Catherine reasoned, her mind already racing with possibilities. "It would also be incredibly dangerous," Kieran pointed out, "especially for you. If anyone recognizes you, they won't," Catherine assured him with more confidence than she felt. "I'll be dressed appropriately, playing a role. Besides, what better place to hide than among Blackwood's own guests?" Kieran studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks against potential rewards. "We'd need a convincing reason to be there. Blackwood knows most of the locals, and I'm hardly the type he'd invite to his social gatherings." "But I could be," Catherine said, an idea taking shape. "A distant relation of Mrs. Haverford, perhaps, recently arrived from the East. You could be my escort." The word hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to address. Kieran cleared his throat. "It's risky." "Everything about this situation is risky," Catherine countered. "But doing nothing guarantees Blackwood gets away with murder." Kieran ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Catherine had come to recognize as a sign of his internal debate. "I'll think about it," he said finally. We'll talk more tomorrow." After he left, Catherine sank onto the edge of her bed, exhaustion suddenly catching up with her. The events of the past days, the attack, her desperate flight through the wilderness, Kieran's rescue, and now their precarious position in Fort Benton had left her emotionally and physically drained. Yet despite her exhaustion, her mind remained active, turning over possibilities and plans. If they could gather evidence against Blackwood, find the missing satchel, they might have a chance at justice. But the path forward was fraught with danger, and one misstep could cost them their lives. As night fell over Fort Benton, Catherine stood at her window, watching the lights of the town flicker to life. Somewhere out there, Kieran was perhaps looking toward this very boarding house, keeping watch. The thought brought a measure of comfort, enough to allow her, finally, to sleep. Morning arrived with a gentle knock on Catherine's door. She opened it to find Mrs. Haverford bearing a tray laden with breakfast and a neatly folded dress draped over one arm. "Good morning, dear," the widow greeted her cheerfully. "I thought you might appreciate breakfast in your room, given your recent travels, and I took the liberty of bringing you one of my daughter's old dresses. She's married and living in Helena now, has no use for it. It might need taking in a bit, but it's of good quality." Catherine accepted both offerings gratefully. "You're very kind, Mrs. Haverford. I don't know how to thank you." "Think nothing of it," the older woman said, waving away her thanks. "Any friend of Mr. Mitchell's deserves special consideration. He's done much for this town, though he'd be the last to admit it." Curiosity piqued, Catherine invited Mrs. Haverford to join her for breakfast, hoping to learn more about the man who had become her unexpected protector. The widow needed little encouragement. "Kieran Mitchell arrived in Fort Benton about 5 years ago," she explained as they shared the meal. "Kept to himself mostly, but always willing to help when needed. During the flood of '72, he worked 3 days straight rescuing folks trapped by rising waters, then disappeared back to his cabin without waiting for thanks." "He mentioned he was in the war," Catherine prompted. "Union cavalry, fought at Gettysburg and several other major battles." "My late husband served alongside him for a time," said Kieran was the bravest man he ever knew, but troubled by what he'd seen. "And his sister? He mentioned she followed him west." Mrs. Haverford's expression softened with sympathy. "Poor Margaret, lovely woman, bright as a new penny. She ran the town's first proper school until the typhoid took her. Kieran was never the same after that, withdrew even further into himself, spent more time in the wilderness." The picture emerging of Kieran was complex, a man shaped by war and loss, who chose solitude but remained connected to the community in his own quiet way. It explained his willingness to help a stranger in distress. He understood what it meant to be alone and vulnerable. As they finished breakfast, Catherine broached the subject that had been on her mind since the previous evening. "Mrs. Haverford, I understand Mr. Blackwood is hosting some kind of reception tonight." "Indeed he is," the widow confirmed. "Celebrating the Railroad Survey Commission approving a route through Fort Benton. It'll bring more business to the town, more opportunities for everyone. At least that's what Mr. Blackwood says." "Will you be attending?" Mrs. Haverford laughed. "Goodness, no. Those affairs are for the town's elite businessmen, politicians, and their wives, not for simple boarding housekeepers." Catherine considered her next words carefully. "I was thinking of attending, actually, with Mr. Mitchell as my escort. It would be an opportunity to meet the leading citizens of Fort Benton, since I'm considering settling here." The widow's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Well, I suppose that makes sense, though I'm surprised Kieran agreed to it. He usually avoids such gatherings like the plague." She studied Catherine with newfound curiosity. "You must be quite special to convince him otherwise." Catherine felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "We're merely acquaintances," as he said, "but he's been kind enough to show me the area." Mrs. Haverford's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation. "Well, if you're planning to attend Blackwood's reception, you'll need something more fashionable than my daughter's old dress." She glanced at the clock on the wall. "I know just the person who can help. Let me send a message to Miss Parker. She's the town's dressmaker and might have something suitable already made up." Before Catherine could protest, Mrs. Haverford bustled out of the room, clearly delighted by this unexpected project. Left alone, Catherine examined her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the proper Boston schoolteacher who had embarked on this journey. Her face was tanned from days in the sun, her eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there before, and her hands showed the beginning of calluses. "Who are you becoming, Catherine Sullivan?" she whispered to her reflection. A knock at the boarding-house door interrupted her musings. Moments later, Mrs. Haverford called up the stairs. "Miss Sullivan, Mr. Mitchell is here to see you." Catherine hurried down to find Kieran waiting in the small sitting room, hat in hand. He looked different, cleaned up, freshly shaved, his usually wild hair tamed somewhat. The sight of him caused an unexpected flutter in her chest. "Good morning," she greeted him, suddenly self-conscious of her borrowed clothes and disheveled appearance. Kieran's eyes softened as they met hers. "You look rested. That's good." Mrs. Haverford bustled around them, straightening doilies and cushions with pointed obviousness. "I'll just put on some coffee, shall I? Give you two some privacy to discuss your acquaintanceship." As the widow disappeared into the kitchen, Kieran raised an eyebrow at Catherine. "Acquaintanceship?" "Your word, not mine," Catherine reminded him with a small smile. "From your introduction yesterday." Kieran acknowledged this with a nod. "Fair enough. Speaking of yesterday, I've been thinking about your suggestion to attend Blackwood's reception." "And?" Catherine prompted when he hesitated. "And I think you're right. It's an opportunity we can't afford to waste. But," he added quickly, seeing her triumphant expression, "we need a solid plan and a believable story." "Mrs. Haverford is already helping with that," Catherine told him. "She's arranging for a suitable dress and seems quite taken with the idea of us attending together. I think she imagines there's more between us than mere acquaintanceship." Kieran cleared his throat, a hint of color rising to his tanned cheeks. "People will talk. It's what they do in small towns." "Let them," Catherine said with more bravado than she felt. "It serves our purpose if they believe we're involved. No one would suspect a couple attending a social event of investigating a murder." The word couple hung between them, neither acknowledging its implications. Kieran moved to the window, looking out at the busy street beyond. "Lawson stopped by the hotel this morning," he said, changing the subject. "He's organized a search of the stagecoach attack site for tomorrow. Meanwhile, he's making discreet inquiries about Blackwood's business dealings." "Did he have any advice about tonight's reception?" "Only to be careful and observe more than we speak." Kieran turned back to face her. "Blackwood is smart, Catherine. He didn't build his empire by being careless. If he suspects we're anything other than what we claim to be." He didn't need to finish the thought. They both understood the stakes. "We'll be careful," Catherine promised. "Play our roles perfectly. No one will suspect a thing." Kieran studied her face, seeming to search for something in her expression. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Catherine Sullivan." "Perhaps a bit of both," she admitted with a small smile. "But I'm also determined to see justice done for Thomas and the others who died on that stagecoach." Before Kieran could respond, Mrs. Haverford returned with coffee and news that Miss Parker would be arriving shortly with dresses for Catherine to try. The conversation shifted to preparations for the evening, practical details that allowed them to temporarily set aside the dangerous reality of what they were undertaking. As they finalized their plans, Catherine couldn't help noticing the way Kieran's gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. There was something in his eyes beyond concern for her safety, something that mirrored the confusing emotions stirring within her own heart. But such feelings were a luxury they couldn't afford, not with their lives hanging in the balance. Tonight was about gathering information, not exploring the growing connection between them. That would have to wait if they survived what was to come. The Blackwood mansion stood like a palace of light against the darkening sky, its windows ablaze with the glow of crystal chandeliers. Situated on a hill overlooking Fort Benton, the imposing structure announced its owner's wealth and status to all who beheld it. Catherine felt her breath catch as their borrowed buggy approached the circular driveway where other carriages were disgorging elegantly dressed guests. This was their moment of greatest vulnerability, the point of no return. "Ready?" Kieran asked quietly, his voice steady despite the tension evident in the set of his shoulders. Catherine smoothed the skirt of her borrowed evening gown, a confection of deep blue silk that Miss Parker had altered in record time to fit her slender frame. "As I'll ever be." Kieran looked striking in a formal suit borrowed from the marshal's deputy, who was of similar build. Though he appeared uncomfortable in the restrictive clothing, the transformation from rugged trapper to gentleman was remarkable. With his dark hair neatly combed and his beard trimmed, he could easily pass for a prosperous businessman or rancher. As they joined the stream of guests making their way up the mansion's broad steps, Catherine slipped her hand into the crook of Kieran's arm, playing the role of devoted companion. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, a reminder of the very real feelings developing beneath their pretense. At the entrance, a servant announced them as Mr. Kieran Mitchell and Miss Catherine Sullivan, causing several nearby guests to turn and look. Catherine felt a moment of panic had she been recognized, before realizing it was merely curiosity about unfamiliar faces at a gathering of the town's established elite. The interior of the mansion was even more opulent than its exterior suggested. The entrance hall soared 2 stories high, dominated by a grand staircase and adorned with oil paintings in gilt frames. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light over marble floors, while livered servants circulated with trays of champagne. "Impressive, isn't it?" came a voice from behind them. Blackwood spares no expense when it comes to displaying his success. They turned to find Marshal Lawson approaching, resplendent in his formal uniform. He gave them a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Marshal," Kieran greeted him with appropriate formality. "Quite a gathering, indeed." Lawson's eyes scanned the room as he spoke. "Our host should be making an appearance shortly. He likes to let his guests marvel at his possessions before gracing them with his presence." As if on cue, a hush fell over the gathering as a man appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Victor Blackwood was younger than Catherine had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with striking features and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to command. His dark hair was peppered with distinguished gray at the temples, and his tailored evening wear spoke of Eastern sophistication. "My friends," Blackwood addressed the assembled guests, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall. "Thank you for joining me on this momentous occasion. The railroad's decision to route through Fort Benton represents the beginning of a new era of prosperity for our community, one we have all worked together to achieve." Polite applause followed this pronouncement. As Blackwood descended the staircase to mingle with his guests, Lawson murmured, "Note who he speaks with first. Those are his inner circle." Catherine observed carefully as Blackwood made his way through the crowd, stopping to exchange words with a select few before others were permitted to approach him. Among the first was a lean, hawk-faced man whose cold eyes seemed to assess each person they fell upon. "Who is that man?" Catherine whispered to Lawson. "The one with Blackwood now. Samuel Reeves," the marshal replied without looking directly at the pair. "Blackwood's right hand. Handles matters his employer prefers not to dirty his hands with." Catherine felt a chill of recognition. Though she had only glimpsed the attackers from a distance, something about Reeves's posture and the calculating coldness of his gaze struck a chord of memory. Could he have been among those who had ambushed the stage coach? "I need to get closer," she murmured to Kieran. "See if I can overhear anything useful." Kieran's hand tightened slightly on hers. "Be careful. Don't draw attention to yourself." With a reassuring squeeze, Catherine released his arm and moved gracefully through the crowd, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server to blend in. She positioned herself near a large floral arrangement within earshot of Blackwood and Reeves, pretending to admire the exotic blooms while straining to catch their conversation. "Still no sign of it," she heard Reeves saying in a low voice. "My men have searched the entire area." "It has to be somewhere," Blackwood replied, his pleasant public demeanor slipping slightly to reveal irritation beneath. "Those documents are the key to everything. Without them—" A guest approached to pay respects to their host, forcing the men to pause their discussion. Catherine remained in place, hoping they would resume once the well-wisher had moved on. Her patience was rewarded when Blackwood leaned close to Reeves once more. "What about the woman? Any trace?" "None," Reeves admitted. "If she survived, she's either fled the territory or found someone to take her in. Either way, she's a loose end we can't afford. Find her," Blackwood ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when you do, make sure she joins the others. Permanently." Catherine felt her blood run cold at the casual way they discussed her murder. She had suspected Blackwood was behind the attack, but hearing the confirmation from his own lips made the danger suddenly more real. So intent was she on their conversation that Catherine didn't notice another guest approaching until a hand touched her arm. She jumped, nearly spilling her champagne. "I don't believe we've been introduced," said a cultured female voice. "I'm Alina Blackwood." Catherine turned to find herself face to face with an elegant woman in her 30s, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure adorned with jeweled pins that matched her emerald gown. Victor Blackwood's wife, undoubtedly. "Catherine Sullivan," she replied, forcing a smile while her heart raced with fear of discovery. "I'm visiting from Boston." "Boston, how delightful. I miss the cultural refinements of the East." Alina's gaze was sharp and assessing despite her pleasant tone. "And who is your escort this evening?" "I don't recall seeing you on our guest list." Before Catherine could formulate a response, Kieran appeared at her side as if sensing her distress. "Kieran Mitchell, madam," he introduced himself with a courtly bow that surprised Catherine. "Miss Sullivan is considering investing in the territory." "I've been showing her the opportunities Fort Benton offers." Alina's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "Mitchell, the trapper. I wouldn't have recognized you without your buckskins." Her tone carried a hint of mockery that raised Catherine's hackles. "Even trappers clean up occasionally, Mrs. Blackwood," Kieran replied with equanimity. "Indeed they do," Alina conceded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, Miss Sullivan, if you're considering investment opportunities, you simply must speak with my husband. He has his finger on the pulse of every venture worth pursuing in the territory." Before Catherine could protest, Alina had signaled to her husband, who excused himself from his current conversation to join them. Catherine felt Kieran tense beside her as Blackwood approached, though his expression remained pleasantly neutral. "Victor, darling, I've just met the most fascinating couple," Alina announced. "Miss Sullivan has come all the way from Boston seeking investment opportunities." Blackwood's sharp eyes studied Catherine with interest. "Is that so? What brings you to our little corner of the frontier, Miss Sullivan?" Catherine called upon years of teaching unruly children to keep her voice steady as she faced the man who had ordered her death. "I recently came into an inheritance and was advised that the Western territories offer greater returns than Eastern ventures." "Your advisor was correct," Blackwood said with a magnanimous smile. "Montana Territory is the land of opportunity. What sort of investments interest you? Mining, cattle?" "Real estate. I'm exploring all possibilities," Catherine replied vaguely. "Mr. Mitchell has been kind enough to show me the area and introduce me to local business leaders." Blackwood turned his attention to Kieran, his gaze sharpening almost imperceptibly. "Mitchell, you're rather far from your usual haunts tonight." "I go where I'm needed, Mr. Blackwood," Kieran replied evenly. A tense silence stretched between the men until Alina broke it with a practiced laugh. "Well, this is a celebration, not a business meeting. Perhaps you two would enjoy a tour of the house. Victor has assembled quite a remarkable collection of art and artifacts." "That's very kind, but," Catherine began, eager to escape Blackwood's presence before he somehow recognized her. "I insist," Alina interrupted smoothly, taking Catherine's arm. "Victor, darling, why don't you and Mr. Mitchell enjoy a brandy in the library while I show Miss Sullivan the conservatory?" It was a command disguised as a suggestion. Catherine shot Kieran a worried glance as they were separated, Alina guiding her firmly toward a set of glass doors leading to what appeared to be a jungle contained within the mansion. The conservatory was indeed impressive, a cathedral of glass and iron filled with exotic plants from around the world. Under different circumstances, Catherine would have been enchanted by the tropical flowers and rare specimens on display. At present, however, her mind was occupied with worry for Kieran and fear that at any moment Blackwood might realize who she was. "It's quite something, isn't it?" Alina remarked as they strolled among the plants. "Victor had it built 3 years ago." "The plants come from as far away as South America and the Orient." "It's magnificent," Catherine agreed absently, her thoughts elsewhere. Alina stopped beside a vibrant orchid, turning to face Catherine directly. "Now, Miss Sullivan, perhaps you could tell me who you really are and what you're doing in my home." Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. "I don't understand. I've told you, please." Alina cut her off with a dismissive wave. "I grew up in New York society. I know an imposter when I meet one." "Your dress is borrowed, the hem has been hastily adjusted. Your hands, despite obvious recent attempts to soften them, show calluses consistent with working rather than leisure. And most tellingly, you flinched when my husband approached you, as if you feared recognition." Catherine stood speechless, caught completely off guard by the woman's perceptiveness. Alina studied her reaction for a moment, then sighed. "I'm not going to expose you," she said in a lower voice. "Not yet, anyway. But I want to know what game you're playing and why you've involved Kieran Mitchell in it." Faced with Alina's unexpected challenge, Catherine made a split-second decision. The truth, or at least part of it, might be her only way forward. "I was on the stagecoach that was attacked 3 days ago," she admitted quietly. "I'm the only survivor. Mr. Mitchell found me injured in the woods and has been helping me recover." Alina's perfectly composed expression flickered briefly with something like concern. "The overland stage." "The one where all passengers were reported killed." "All except me," Catherine confirmed. "I escaped during the attack and hid. The men responsible have been hunting me ever since. And you believe my husband is connected to this attack?" Eleanor's voice was carefully neutral, but Catherine detected a tremor beneath the composure. "I heard one of the attackers mention the name Blackwood," Catherine said, watching Eleanor closely for her reaction. "I came here tonight hoping to discover if there was indeed a connection." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the exotic flowers surrounding them. "My husband," she finally said, "is a man of great ambition and little restraint when it comes to achieving his goals. I am not blind to his methods, though I have chosen to turn a blind eye to much." "Then you believe he could be responsible?" Catherine pressed, hardly daring to hope for such an admission. Eleanor's eyes flashed back to Catherine, suddenly hard. "I believe nothing without evidence, Miss Sullivan, and more importantly, I protect my family's interests above all else." Before Catherine could respond, Eleanor continued, "You're playing a dangerous game, infiltrating my husband's home under false pretenses. Victor is not a man who forgives such deceptions." "I'm only seeking justice for those who were murdered," Catherine insisted. "Justice," Eleanor repeated with a bitter smile. "A noble sentiment, but one that rarely prevails against power and money." She adjusted one of her jeweled hairpins with a practiced gesture. "Let me give you some advice, Miss Sullivan. Take whatever charity Kieran Mitchell has offered you and leave Fort Benton. Go to Helena, or better yet, return to Boston. There is nothing for you here but danger." "I can't do that," Catherine said quietly. "Not without seeing justice done." Eleanor studied her with something like pity. "Then I fear you've signed your own death warrant, and possibly Mitchell's as well." The implication sent a chill through Catherine. "Are you threatening us, Mrs. Blackwood?" "Warning you," Eleanor corrected. "There's a distinction. Now, we should return to the party before our absence becomes conspicuous." As they made their way back to the main hall, Eleanor maintained a stream of light conversation about the plants they had seen, as if their serious discussion had never occurred. Catherine followed her lead, her mind racing with the implications of what had transpired. They found Kieran and Blackwood emerging from the library, both men wearing neutral expressions that revealed nothing of their conversation. Kieran's eyes immediately sought Catherine's, a question in their depths that she answered with a slight nod. She was unharmed. "Ah, there you are, my dear," Blackwood greeted his wife. "I hope you've been entertaining our guest properly." "Of course, darling. Miss Sullivan has exquisite taste in horticulture." Eleanor's performance was flawless, her earlier confrontation completely masked behind social niceties. "I was just telling Mr. Mitchell that we must have you both to dinner soon," Blackwood said smoothly. "Perhaps next week." "That would be lovely," Catherine replied automatically, though the thought of voluntarily returning to this house filled her with dread. "Unfortunately, we must take our leave," Kieran interjected. "Miss Sullivan is still recovering from the rigors of her journey west." Blackwood's smile remained fixed, but something cold entered his eyes. "Of course. I hope we'll have the opportunity to continue our discussion soon, Mitchell. It was most enlightening." As they exchanged formal goodbyes, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were being allowed to leave rather than actually getting away. Eleanor's parting handshake included a small slip of paper pressed into Catherine's palm, which she discreetly tucked into her glove. The drive back to town passed in tense silence, both of them aware that speaking freely might be dangerous before they were safely away from Blackwood's domain. Only when Fort Benton's lights came into view did Kieran finally speak. "Blackwood knows," he said simply. "Not everything, perhaps, but enough to be suspicious. He spent our entire conversation trying to determine how much I know about the stagecoach attack." "What did you tell him?" "That I've been trapping in the mountains for the past week and only recently returned to town." But I don't think he believed me. Kieran glanced at her. What about Alina? She seemed quite intent on separating us. Catherine hesitated, then reached into her glove to retrieve the small slip of paper. In elegant handwriting were the words, "North side of the old mission, midnight, come alone." She knows I was on the stagecoach, Catherine admitted, showing Kieran the note. She confronted me directly about it, though she claimed she wouldn't expose me to her husband. Kieran frowned at the paper. This could be a trap, or it could be help from an unexpected quarter. Alina didn't seem surprised by the suggestion that her husband might be involved in the attack. In fact, she as good as admitted she knows about his illegal activities, but chooses to ignore them. Doesn't mean she's willing to turn against him, Kieran pointed out. Family loyalty runs deep, especially when that family enjoys wealth and power. They lapsed into silence again as they reached the boarding house. Kieran helped Catherine down from the buggy, his hand lingering on hers longer than necessary. "What are you thinking?" she asked, recognizing the thoughtful set of his jaw. "I'm thinking it's too dangerous for you to meet Alina alone," he said finally, "but also too dangerous to ignore what might be our only lead. So we go together," Catherine suggested. "You can watch from a distance, ready to intervene if it's a trap." Kieran nodded slowly. "We should tell Lawson. He'll want to know about this development." As they entered the boarding house, Mrs. Haverford greeted them eagerly, clearly waiting up to hear about their evening among Fort Benton's elite. Catherine did her best to satisfy the widow's curiosity, while avoiding any mention of the true nature of their visit to the Blackwood mansion. Once they had escaped to the privacy of Catherine's room, Kieran paced the small space while they debated their next move. The midnight meeting was less than 2 hours away, leaving them little time to formulate a plan. "I don't like this," Kieran said for what seemed the dozenth time. "It's too convenient, too risky. But if Alina is willing to help us, to provide evidence against her husband, it could be exactly what we need," Catherine countered. "Marshal Lawson said himself that we need more than just my testimony." Kieran stopped pacing to look at her directly. "And if it's a trap? If Blackwood recognized you and is using his wife to lure you into the open? Then you'll be there to help me escape," Catherine said simply, her trust in him absolute. Something shifted in Kieran's expression at her words, a softening, a vulnerability that matched what she felt herself. The tension of the evening, the constant danger they had faced together, had forged a bond between them that transcended their brief acquaintance. "Catherine," he began, his voice rough with emotion. She closed the distance between them, placing her hand against his cheek. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too, but we can't, not now, not until this is over." Kieran covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss against her palm, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "After then," he promised. "When you're safe. When this is finished." "After," she agreed, the word a covenant between them. With reluctance, they separated, returning to the practical matter at hand. Kieran would alert Marshal Lawson to the midnight meeting while Catherine changed into more suitable clothing for what might become another flight through the wilderness if things went wrong. As Catherine shed the borrowed finery of Alina Blackwood's world, she found herself wondering what waited for them at the old mission. A trap, a betrayal, or perhaps, against all odds, an ally in their dangerous quest for justice. Only midnight would tell. The old mission stood like a ghost against the night sky, its weathered walls and broken bell tower testament to years of neglect. Once a place of worship for local tribes under the guidance of Jesuit priests, it had been abandoned during the conflicts of the 1860s and now served only as a crumbling landmark on the outskirts of Fort Benton. Catherine approached cautiously, her borrowed riding boots silent on the overgrown path. She had exchanged her evening gown for the practical skirt and blouse provided by Mrs. Haverford, with the addition of Kieran's spare jacket for warmth against the night chill. Kieran himself was positioned somewhere in the darkness, watching over her from a distance as agreed. Marshal Lawson, after hearing their plan, had stationed 2 deputies within shouting distance close enough to provide assistance if needed, but not so close as to frighten off Alina if she truly meant to help. The north side of the mission featured a small cemetery, its wooden crosses tilting at odd angles among tall grass and wildflowers. Catherine's skin prickled with unease as she made her way through this garden of the dead, her eyes straining for any sign of movement. "Miss Sullivan." The voice came from the shadows beside the mission wall, causing Catherine to start despite her preparation. Alina Blackwood emerged into a shaft of moonlight, her elegant evening attire replaced by a simple dark dress and cloak. Without her elaborate hairstyle and jewels, she looked younger and somehow more vulnerable. "Mrs. Blackwood," Catherine acknowledged, keeping a cautious distance between them. "You wanted to meet." Alina glanced around nervously. "Are you alone?" "Yes," Catherine lied smoothly. "Though I admit I question the wisdom of coming here without protection." "You were right to be cautious," Alina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victor suspects you were on that stagecoach. After you left, he had a heated discussion with Reeves. Your description was given to all the household staff with instructions to alert him immediately if you're seen again." Catherine's heart sank at this confirmation of their fears. "Then you've risked a great deal coming here tonight." "Why?" Alina hesitated, internal conflict evident on her face. "Because 4 people were murdered," she said finally. "And while I've turned a blind eye to many of Victor's methods over the years, I never agreed to become accomplice to murder." "Then you admit your husband was behind the attack?" "I admit nothing," Alina snapped, then immediately moderated her tone. "But I know my husband. I know what he's capable of when his interests are threatened. And I know he's been obsessed with acquiring certain land rights along the proposed railroad route, land controlled by a Boston law firm. Thomas Jenkins' firm. The pieces were falling into place." "You have evidence?" Catherine pressed. "Something Marshal Lawson could use to build a case against those responsible." Alina reached into her cloak and withdrew a small leather-bound book. "Victor keeps meticulous records of all his transactions, both legal and otherwise. This is his personal ledger for the past 3 months. It documents payments to Reeves for special services on the dates surrounding the stagecoach attack." Catherine accepted the book with trembling hands, hardly able to believe their luck. "This could be exactly what we need. But why would you betray your husband this way?" Alina's face hardened. "I'm not betraying him. I'm saving him from himself. If Victor is connected to these murders, it's only a matter of time before the truth emerges. Better it happens now, while there's still a chance for him to make a deal, than after more blood is shed." There was a logic to her reasoning, though Catherine suspected there was more to the story than Alina was revealing. Whatever her motivations, the ledger represented their best chance at justice. "Thank you," Catherine said sincerely. "I'll ensure Marshal Lawson knows of your assistance when the time comes." "No," Alina cut her off sharply. "My name stays out of this. As far as anyone knows, you found this book, or it was anonymously delivered. I will not testify against my husband, nor will I publicly stand against him." "Is that understood?" Catherine nodded her agreement, though she wondered how practical such anonymity would prove once the ledger was presented as evidence. Victor Blackwood would surely guess the source of the betrayal. As if reading her thoughts, Alina added, "By the time this reaches a courtroom, I'll be long gone from Fort Benton. I've made my own arrangements." A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, causing both women to tense. Eleanor clutched Catherine's arm, her composure cracking for the first time. "You need to leave. Now. If Victor discovers I'm gone from the house, it's too late for that, my dear," came a cold voice from the shadows. Victor Blackwood stepped into the moonlight, flanked by Samuel Reeves, and another man Catherine recognized with a jolt of fear, one of the attackers from the stagecoach. "Victor," Eleanor gasped, instinctively moving closer to Catherine. Blackwood's face was a mask of controlled fury as he regarded his wife. "I suspected someone in my household was feeding information to my enemies. I never imagined it would be you." "It's not what you think," Eleanor began, but Blackwood cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Spare me your explanations. I heard enough." He turned his cold gaze to Catherine. "And you, Miss Sullivan, the sole survivor of our little stagecoach misunderstanding, I must admit you've proven more resourceful than expected." Catherine clutched the ledger tightly, wondering if she could somehow signal Kieran or the deputies without being detected. Blackwood seemed to read her intentions. "I wouldn't waste energy hoping for rescue," he said smoothly. "Your protector, Mr. Mitchell, encountered some unexpected difficulties on his way here. My men can be quite persuasive when necessary." Fear clutched at Catherine's heart. Had they captured Kieran, injured him? Or worse? "You're lying," she challenged, desperate to believe it was a bluff. "Am I?" Blackwood smiled, the expression chilling in its lack of warmth. "Reeves, show Miss Sullivan what becomes of those who interfere in my business." Reeves stepped forward, reaching inside his coat. But instead of producing evidence of Kieran's fate, he suddenly stiffened, a look of surprise crossing his face before he crumpled to the ground. A moment later, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the cemetery, the delay indicating the shot had come from some distance away. Chaos erupted. Blackwood's remaining man drew his weapon, firing blindly into the darkness. Eleanor screamed as Blackwood grabbed her arm, dragging her toward him. Catherine seized the moment of confusion to dive behind a nearby tombstone, still clutching the precious ledger. More shots rang out, followed by shouts as Marshal Lawson's deputies joined the fray. Through the pandemonium, Catherine caught glimpses of figures moving in the darkness, the flash of gunfire illuminating frozen tableau of struggle. Suddenly, Kieran was beside her, his face streaked with dirt and blood from a cut above his eyebrow. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, hands moving over her shoulders as if to reassure himself of her solidity. "No," she gasped, relief flooding through her at the sight of him. "Blackwood said his men had caught you." "They tried," Kieran confirmed grimly. "We need to move now. Lawson and his men are engaging Blackwood's reinforcements at the north end. This is our chance to get you safely away." "What about Eleanor?" Kieran glanced toward where Blackwood was using his wife as a shield while retreating toward a stand of trees. "Lawson will do what he can, but our priority is your safety and securing whatever evidence she gave you." Catherine nodded, understanding the brutal calculus of the situation. They crouched low, making their way along the cemetery's edge toward a small ravine that would provide cover for their escape. They had almost reached it when a bullet splintered the wooden cross beside Catherine's head. "Going somewhere, Miss Sullivan." Blackwood stood 20 feet away, alone now, a revolver trained on them. There was no sign of Eleanor. Kieran immediately moved to place himself between Catherine and the gun. "It's over, Blackwood. Lawson has your men. The evidence of your crimes is secure. Surrender now, and you might avoid the hangman's noose." A harsh laugh escaped Blackwood's lips. "Ever the hero, Mitchell. Did you know I offered him a partnership once?" He addressed this to Catherine. "Years ago, when he first came to the territory. I recognized his intelligence, his potential. But he refused, claimed his conscience wouldn't allow it." His voice dripped with contempt. Look where conscience has brought you, Mitchell, about to die in a forgotten graveyard alongside this interfering woman. You talk too much, Blackwood, Kieran replied evenly. Always have. The distraction worked as intended. As Blackwood's attention focused on Kieran, a shot rang out from the darkness behind him. Blackwood staggered, the revolver dropping from his grasp as he clutched his shoulder. From the shadows emerged Alina, a small derringer still smoking in her hand. "That's enough, Victor," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "No more bloodshed." Marshal Lawson arrived moments later, taking in the tableau with experienced eyes before ordering his deputies to secure Blackwood and summon a doctor. As Blackwood was led away, cursing and threatening all manner of retribution, Alina approached Catherine and Kieran. "I suppose my plans for a quiet departure have been somewhat compromised," she said with remarkable composure given the circumstances. "You saved our lives," Catherine acknowledged. "Why?" Alina glanced toward where her husband was being loaded into a wagon, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps I'm finally choosing a side, or perhaps I simply couldn't watch him commit another murder before my eyes." She turned back to Catherine. "The ledger will be enough to implicate him in the stagecoach attack. Combined with your testimony and what the marshal discovered at the attack site today, Victor's fate is sealed." "What did Lawson find?" Kieran asked sharply. "The satchel," Alina revealed. "Hidden beneath a fallen tree not far from where the stagecoach was stopped. Victor's men searched for days but overlooked it. The marshal's more thorough approach proved successful." Catherine felt dizzy with the implications. The documents were recovered. With the satchel, the ledger, and her testimony, justice for Thomas and the other victims was within reach. As dawn broke over Fort Benton, Catherine sat beside Kieran on the boardwalk outside the marshal's office, both too wired from the night's events to consider sleep. Blackwood was under guard at the doctor's office, his wound being treated before he would be transferred to the jail. Alina had been placed under nominal house arrest at the boarding house, though Lawson had indicated he had no intention of charging her as an accomplice given her eventual cooperation. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, watching the town slowly come to life around them. "Lawson sends for the circuit judge," Kieran explained. "There'll be a trial, though with the evidence we've gathered it should be straightforward. Blackwood, Reeves if he survives his wound, and any others implicated in the attack will face justice. And after?" The question held more weight than its simple phrasing suggested. Kieran turned to look at her, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear with gentle fingers. "After is up to you, Catherine. You could return to Boston, or continue to your cousin in Helena as originally planned. Or—" she prompted when he hesitated. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his serious features. "Or you could stay. Fort Benton needs a schoolteacher. The position has been vacant since, well, for some time." "Since your sister," Catherine filled in softly. Kieran nodded, vulnerability evident in his eyes. "Maggie would have liked you. She always said this town needed more strong-minded women to balance all the stubborn men." Catherine laughed, the sound bright in the early morning stillness. "And what about you, Kieran Mitchell? What do you need?" He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I think I found what I need the moment I saw you in those woods, though I'll admit it took me a while to recognize it." Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, exhaustion and emotion finally catching up with her. "I'm not sure I'm cut out for the life of a frontier schoolteacher." "And I'm not sure I'm cut out for town living," Kieran countered. "But I'm willing to try if you are. Maybe find a middle ground, a place not too far from town but with enough wilderness to satisfy my need for space." The future they were sketching was tentative, fragile, but filled with possibility. Catherine thought of the journey that had brought her here, the loss, the danger, the unexpected discovery of strength she hadn't known she possessed. And now, the discovery of this man whose quiet courage and unwavering support had come to mean everything to her. "I'm willing to try," she agreed, turning her face up to his. Kieran's kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a demand, but it held all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them since that first moment in the woods when he had said those words that had become her anchor. "You can rest now. I've got you." When they finally parted, the sun had risen fully above the horizon, painting Fort Benton in shades of gold and amber. A new day in a town that might just become home. "So," Catherine said, a smile playing at her lips, "when does a frontier school teacher begin her duties?" "Not until you've had proper rest and recovery," Kieran insisted. "And not until Blackwood's trial is concluded, one challenge at a time." Catherine nodded, suddenly overcome with exhaustion now that the immediate danger had passed. "Rest sounds wonderful, actually." "I don't think I've truly slept since the stagecoach." Kieran stood, offering his hand to help her up. "Then rest you shall have, doctor's orders." "You're not a doctor," she pointed out with a tired laugh. "No, but I know what healing requires." His eyes held hers, serious once more. "Time, patience, and someone who cares enough to see it through." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Catherine's hand securely in Kieran's, she reflected that healing was indeed what had begun here, not just from the physical wounds of her ordeal, but from deeper injuries of loss and loneliness that had driven her to seek a new beginning in this wild territory. In finding justice for those who had died, she had unexpectedly found something more precious for herself. A future filled with purpose and love in this rugged land that was slowly beginning to feel like home. 10 years later, the schoolhouse bell rang out across the valley, signaling the end of another day of learning. Catherine Mitchell stood in the doorway, watching as her students spilled out into the late spring sunshine, their voices raised in laughter and chatter as they raced toward waiting parents or headed home in small groups. "Mrs. Mitchell," called 8-year-old Sarah Jenkins, bouncing back to the schoolhouse steps. "I almost forgot to give you this. Mama made extra preserves and said you'd appreciate some." Catherine accepted the small jar with a warm smile. "Thank you, Sarah. Please tell your mother they're my favorite." As the last child disappeared down the path, Catherine gathered her books and locked the schoolhouse door. The building had been rebuilt 5 years ago, larger and sturdier than the original structure, with large windows to capture the beautiful Montana light, and a small bell tower that had become a point of pride for the community. The walk home took her along the edge of Fort Benton, now a thriving town twice the size it had been when she first arrived. The railroad had indeed come, bringing with it new businesses, new families, and a sense of permanence that had transformed the frontier outpost into a proper settlement. Catherine's path took her beyond the town limits, following a well-worn trail that wound through meadows brilliant with spring wildflowers, before climbing a gentle rise to where a sturdy log house stood surrounded by aspen trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the sound of childish laughter carried on the breeze. As she crested the hill, Catherine paused to take in the scene before her. In the yard, Kieran was demonstrating something to their 7-year-old son, Thomas, who watched with rapt attention as his father's hands shaped a piece of wood with a small knife. Nearby, 4-year-old Margaret chased butterflies, her dark curls bouncing with each step. The sight of them, her family, her home, still had the power to stop Catherine's breath with gratitude. After Blackwood's trial and conviction, she and Kieran had married in a simple ceremony at the newly rebuilt church, with Marshall Lawson giving the bride away and Mrs. Haverford shedding happy tears in the front pew. Their home had been Kieran's wedding gift to her, built with his own hands on land that balanced his need for wilderness with her desire to remain connected to the community. Close enough to town for Catherine to continue teaching, yet far enough into the hills for Kieran to maintain his connection to the natural world he loved. He had compromised his solitary trapper's life, establishing instead a successful business guiding hunting parties and geological surveys through the territory. The arrangement allowed him to use his wilderness skills while returning regularly to the family that had become his center. As if sensing her presence, Kieran looked up, a smile spreading across his face that still, after all these years, caused her heart to skip. He set aside his work and stood, saying something to Thomas before walking toward her. "Teacher's home," he called, reaching her in a few long strides and taking the books from her arms. "How were the young scholars today?" "Restless," Catherine admitted with a laugh. "Spring fever has them all dreaming of summer freedom." Kieran leaned down to kiss her, the familiar gesture no less sweet for its daily repetition. "Can't blame them. It's a day for being outdoors. Papa showed me how to carve a bear," Thomas announced, racing up to show Catherine his project, a small, somewhat lumpy piece of wood that bore only the vaguest resemblance to any animal. "It's wonderful," she praised, ruffling his hair. "You have your father's talented hands." Margaret arrived at a full run, launching herself into Catherine's arms with complete confidence she would be caught. "Mama, I found the prettiest butterfly. It was yellow with black spots and it almost landed on my nose. Did it now?" Catherine hugged her daughter close, breathing in the scent of sunshine and grass that clung to her hair. "That sounds like a special butterfly indeed." As they walked toward the house together, Kieran's arm around her shoulders, the children dancing ahead, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From terror and exhaustion in the Montana wilderness to this life of purpose, and love, a transformation as complete as that of Fort Benton itself. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, filled with a blend of Kieran's frontier practicality and Catherine's Eastern refinement. Bookshelves lined one wall of the main room, filled with volumes for both education and pleasure. Kieran's carved figures, bears, eagles, wolves shared space with Catherine's collection of pressed wildflowers and children's artwork. Through the window, the distant peaks of mountains reminded them daily of the vastness beyond their domestic circle. After dinner, when the children had been tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Catherine and Kieran sat together on the porch, watching darkness settle over the land they had come to love. The evening ritual was one they both treasured, a quiet moment to reconnect after busy days spent in their separate worlds. "Letter came from Helena today," Kieran mentioned, passing her an envelope. "From your cousin Emily." Catherine opened it eagerly, scanning the pages by the light spilling from the open doorway. "She's coming for a visit next month," she announced with pleasure, "and bringing her youngest to consider leaving him with us for schooling in the fall. Think the town's ready for another Sullivan." Kieran teased. "The last one caused quite a stir." Catherine leaned against him, content in the solid warmth of his presence. "This town could use a little stirring up now and then. Keeps everyone on their toes." Kieran laughed, the sound rumbling pleasantly beneath her ear. "You've certainly kept me on mine for the past decade." "Regrets?" she asked, though she knew the answer. He turned to look at her, the love in his eyes as clear and unwavering as it had been on their wedding day. "Not a single one. You." Catherine thought of Boston, of the life she had left behind, the safety, the predictability, the constraints. And then of all she had found here: purpose, freedom, partnership, love. The dangers they had faced together, the home they had built, the family they had created. "Only that I didn't find you sooner," she said softly, reaching up to trace the lines that time and weather had etched around his eyes. Kieran caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm in an echo of that first tender gesture so many years ago. "We found each other exactly when we were meant to, Catherine. Not a moment too soon or too late." As night deepened around them, stars emerging in the vast Montana sky, Catherine recognized the truth in his words. Every step of her journey, even the frightening ones, had led her precisely where she needed to be to this man, this family, this life that had become more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined when she first set out from Boston seeking a new beginning. She had been exhausted from running and fighting when Kieran found her in those woods a decade ago, offering safety and rest. What neither of them could have known then was that his simple promise, "You can rest now, I've got you," would become the foundation of a love story written across the wilderness of Montana territory and into the deepest places of their hearts.